January 17, 1945, Luzon, Philippine Islands. The air tasted of burnt aviation fuel and cordite. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto crouched in the tall kogon grass, his flight suit torn at the shoulder, blood mixing with sweat beneath the tropical sun. 200 meters away, the wreckage of what had been a B-29 superfortress lay scattered across a rice paddy, like the broken spine of some mechanical leviathan. Smoke still curled from its fuselage, black and oily against the white-hot sky. Yamamoto had watched it fall, had put 3 cannon rounds into its number 3 engine before his own Zero took hits from the tail gunner. Both machines had come down within sight of each other, one a flaming comet, the other a wounded bird spiraling into the jungle canopy. He had survived the crash. His neck ached, his vision blurred at the edges, but he could walk. The Americans would come looking for their crew. He needed to reach the wreckage first, to gather intelligence, maps, equipment, anything that might justify the loss of his aircraft, anything to bring back to his commander at Clark Field. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service had lost so many planes in recent months that each downed enemy bomber needed to yield something valuable, some small compensation for the arithmetic of attrition that was bleeding Japan's Air Forces white. He moved through the grass, Type 94 pistol drawn, ears tuned to the sounds of the countryside. Farmers had fled. Water buffalo stood unattended in their wallows. Somewhere distant, a dog barked. He approached the wreckage carefully, scanning for survivors, for movement. The bomber had broken into 3 sections. The tail was gone entirely, probably still tumbling through the clouds when he'd pulled out of his dive. The cockpit had accordioned against a bamboo thicket. The midsection, the belly of the beast where the bomb bay doors hung open like broken jaws, lay relatively intact, tilted on its side, silver-scorched black in streaks. He climbed through a rupture in the fuselage, pistol raised. Inside, the bomber smelled different than he expected, not just burning rubber and hydraulic fluid, but something else. Something that reminded him, impossibly, of his childhood summers in Yokohama before the war, before the rationing, before the hunger that had become Japan's constant companion. It smelled like he couldn't place it at first. Then he saw it. A refrigerator. Not a cooling box, not an insulated container packed with ice, an actual electric refrigerator humming faintly on emergency power built into the crew compartment wall between 2 equipment racks. Its door had sprung open in the crash, and its contents had spilled across the deck. Glass bottles of milk, their caps still sealed, sticks of butter wrapped in wax paper, fresh eggs in a cardboard carton, cuts of red meat in butcher's wrap, heads of lettuce, tomatoes, a whole roasted chicken still glistening with fat. Yamamoto stood there in the wreckage, his pistol slowly lowering, staring at food he hadn't seen in 3 years. Fresh food, cold food, food that wasn't millet or pickled radish, or the thin fish soup that constituted an officer's ration at Clark Field. His hands began to shake, not from fear or adrenaline, but from something deeper, something that reached past his training and his loyalty and his willingness to die for the Emperor. It reached into the hollow place in his stomach that had been empty for so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. The Americans had built a refrigerator into their bomber. They had fresh milk at 20,000 feet. The war, Lieutenant Yamamoto understood in that moment, was already lost. Not because of the refrigerator itself, but because of what it represented, an industrial power so vast, so incomprehensibly abundant, that it could afford to carry fresh food into battle, an enemy so wealthy that its soldiers flew into combat with butter and eggs and whole roasted chickens. Japan was starving its pilots to keep them light enough to fly, to conserve every drop of fuel, every bullet, every bolt, and America was installing refrigerators in its bombers. He picked up the bottle of milk with trembling fingers. The glass was cold, perfectly, impossibly cold. He could see condensation forming on its surface, little beads of water materializing from the humid Philippine air. Through the bottle, the milk was pure white, not the grayish powder mixed with water that officers sometimes received as a luxury. This was real milk from real cows, milk that had been fresh enough to require refrigeration, milk that came from a place where there were still enough cows to produce surplus, enough electricity to run dairies, enough metal to build trucks to deliver it, enough rubber for tires, enough gasoline to run the trucks, enough of everything. Enough. That was the word that separated their worlds. America had enough. Japan had nothing left but will, and will could not power aircraft or fill empty bellies or turn back the tide of silver bombers that darkened the sky each day in ever greater numbers. Yamamoto sat down hard on the tilted deck, the milk bottle still in his hands, and for the first time since Midway, he allowed himself to think the unthinkable. Japan could not win this war. It had never been able to win this war. From the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, the outcome had been determined not by courage or skill or divine favor, but by something as mundane and absolute as industrial capacity, by refrigerators and bombers. Somewhere in the distance, he heard American voices calling out, searchers looking for their crew. He should run. He should take what intelligence he could and disappear into the jungle. But he sat there a moment longer, holding that cold bottle of milk, and remembered what it felt like to be full. The path to that moment, to a Japanese pilot sitting in the wreckage of an American bomber,
confronting the abyss between his nation's resources and his enemy's abundance, had been laid long before the first shots of the Pacific War. It began not with military strategy or naval doctrine, but with the fundamental economic realities that divided the United States and the Empire of Japan in the late 1930s. It began with steel production and oil reserves, with agricultural output and manufacturing capacity, with all the unglamorous arithmetic that determined which nations could sustain industrial warfare and which would exhaust themselves in the attempt. In 1941, when Japan launched its campaign to secure the resources of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, the disparity was already staggering. The United States produced approximately 63.
The Americans, Ito had heard, simply replaced aircraft when they accumulated too many flight hours. They didn't repair, they discarded and replaced. This seemed impossibly wasteful to Japanese sensibilities, but it also meant American pilots flew new or nearly new aircraft, machines operating at peak performance without the quirks and degradation that came with extended use. A Japanese pilot had to know his aircraft intimately, had to compensate for its particular weaknesses and eccentricities. An American pilot could transition between aircraft seamlessly because they all performed to spec. These thoughts kept Ito awake, circling through his mind like the fighters that had circled his formation that morning. He thought about food, about the meals he'd eaten before the war, about his mother's cooking, about the small restaurant in his neighborhood that served katsu, fried pork cutlet, rich and savory, served with cabbage and rice. He hadn't eaten pork in 3 years. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten until he was full. Hunger had become such a constant companion that its absence would have felt strange. Did the American pilot who'd spared him ever feel hungry? Ito doubted it. Americans came from a place of plenty. Everyone knew that. They were soft because they'd never known hardship, never experienced the discipline that came from deprivation. Except the pilot hadn't seemed soft. He'd seemed competent and deadly and utterly assured, flying a machine that responded to his inputs with precision, operating within a system that provided everything he needed to focus entirely on combat. Ito flew 3 more missions from Clark Field before the base was evacuated. He survived all 3, more by luck than skill, dodging American fighters and limping home with battle damage each time. Other pilots were less fortunate. Replacements arrived, young men with even less training than Ito, some with barely 50 hours of flight time, one with only 30. They died quickly. Ito watched them die and felt nothing, because feeling would have been unbearable. Grief was a luxury for people with futures. Ito had no future. None of them did. In March, Ito's unit was withdrawn to Formosa, then to southern Japan. Fuel was so scarce that training flights ceased entirely. Pilots sat in their barracks, losing their edge, their skills deteriorating from disuse. Mechanics hoarded fuel in hidden caches, rationing it drop by drop, knowing that when it was gone, there would be no more. Food supplies deteriorated further. The naval blockade had tightened around Japan's home islands until nothing got through. Cities began to starve. Military rations were cut, then cut again. Ito's daily meal shrank to 2 rice balls and watery soup. He grew thin, his flight suit hanging loose on his frame. In April, American forces invaded Okinawa. Ito's squadron received orders to conduct special attack missions, Toko, though everyone knew the more common term, kamikaze, divine wind. Pilots would load their aircraft with explosives and dive into American ships. 1 plane, 1 pilot, 1 ship. The mathematics of attrition recalculated for maximum effect, trading 1 aircraft and 1 life for an entire vessel. Ito received his orders with a resignation that felt like peace. There would be no more combat missions where he dodged death by luck, no more nights lying awake wondering when his number would come up. He would die, but it would be death with purpose, death that might sink an American carrier, death that would be honored. His name would be enshrined at Yasukuni. His family would receive notification of his glorious sacrifice. The hunger, the fear, the grinding hopelessness, all of it would end. The night before his scheduled mission, Ito wrote letters to his family. He wrote carefully, using the prescribed phrases, expressing gratitude for the honor of dying for the emperor. He didn't write about hunger or fear or the slow disintegration of his squadron. He didn't write about the American pilot who'd spared him or the questions that had haunted him since. He wrote what he was supposed to write, sealed the letters, and handed them to his commander. Then he walked outside. It was a clear night, stars brilliant overhead. Somewhere out there, American ships were maneuvering around Okinawa, their crews eating hot meals, their bunks supplied with clean sheets, their galleys stocked with food, coffee and bread and canned fruit and fresh water, refrigerators probably, ice cream machines, all the absurd abundance of a nation that had never known want. Ito stood under those stars and thought about the fundamental unfairness of it all. He had been a good student, a respectful son, a dutiful citizen. He had trained hard as any pilot could train. He had flown his missions with courage, and he was going to die tomorrow, hungry and 19 years old, because his nation had miscalculated the war it started, had failed to anticipate how vast the gulf was between its resources and its enemies, had sent its young men to die in a war that could not be won. The Americans probably had pilots Ito's age, but those pilots would live through the war. They would go home to abundance, to a nation unscathed by bombing, to families who were well-fed and healthy. They would have futures, college, careers, children, long lives. Ito would have tomorrow, and then nothing. He didn't feel anger. Anger would have been pointless. Instead, he felt a deep, oceanic sadness, grief not just for himself, but for all the pilots who died hungry, for all the soldiers starving on bypassed islands, for his whole nation hurtling towards destruction because the mathematics had been wrong from the beginning. You couldn't fight a war on empty stomachs against an enemy with refrigerators in their bombers. Spirit, however pure, could not overcome that disparity. Yamato Damashi could not digest slogans or manufacture fuel from determination. Japan fought bravely and skillfully and with utter devotion, and it lost anyway, because courage was not enough and never had been. The next morning, Ito's mission was scrubbed. His aircraft had developed engine trouble, chronic overheating from worn components that couldn't be replaced. He would fly the next day instead, but the next day brought more mechanical problems, and the day after that. His squadron commander, himself exhausted and starving, began to suspect Ito's mechanic was sabotaging the aircraft to save the young pilot's life. Perhaps he was. Perhaps the mechanic, older and wiser, understood that the war was already lost and saw no point in wasting more lives on symbolic gestures. Ito never flew his Toko mission. The war ended in August, the emperor's voice crackling over radio speakers, announcing surrender in language so formal and archaic that many listeners struggled to understand it. Japan had endured the unendurable and was now tasked with suffering what could not be suffered. The war was over. Ito survived. He went home to a nation in ruins, a people starving, cities burned to ash. His family had survived too, barely. His father dead from malnutrition-related illness, his mother and sisters so thin he barely recognized them. Japan's food situation after surrender was catastrophic. The infrastructure that had distributed even inadequate rations had collapsed. Cities began to starve. The occupation forces, under American command, organized emergency food shipments. American grain arrived in Japanese ports, wheat and corn that would be distributed to prevent mass famine. American food was what kept Ito's family alive that first winter after surrender. This fact seemed like the final irony, the ultimate symbol of how thoroughly Japan had miscalculated. The nation that had gone to war to escape Western domination, to secure resources and autonomy, now survived on American charity. The nation whose propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft and decadent now depended on American abundance for basic survival. Years later, Ito would write about his wartime experiences. He would describe the hunger, the fear, the slow realization that the war was unwinnable, and he would describe that moment at Clark Field, eating thin soup and rice, while somewhere American bomber crews ate from refrigerators. That image crystallized everything for him, the vast gulf between the nations, the impossibility of Japanese victory, the sheer scale of the miscalculation. Japan had been fighting an economic war with military means, and economics had won.
Understanding this disparity was psychologically devastating for Japanese military personnel. They had been raised on narratives of Japanese exceptionalism, of spiritual superiority compensating for material disadvantage, of divine protection ensuring victory for a righteous cause. The refrigerators destroyed those narratives. They proved that material advantage was decisive, that spirit could not overcome industrial capacity.
that Japanese righteousness meant nothing against American abundance. This lesson was learned at terrible cost. Millions died, Japanese soldiers and civilians, victims of a war that arithmetic showed was unwinnable from the start. The bombing campaigns, the starvation, the desperate final battles, all could have been avoided if Japanese leaders had accurately assessed the balance of power before attacking Pearl Harbor. But they didn't. They convinced themselves that American will was weak, that quick victories would force negotiation, that Japan could win before American industry fully mobilized. They were wrong, and the refrigerators proved it. Every aspect of American military operations demonstrated the same fundamental truth: abundance enables power. A nation that can feed its troops fresh food in combat zones is a nation with logistics capabilities that translate to military dominance. A nation that worries about morale through ice cream machines is a nation confident enough in its resources to prioritize psychological factors. A nation that installs refrigerators in bombers is a nation that has already won, even if the fighting continues. For Japanese pilots sitting in bomber wreckage, holding bottles of cold milk, this truth was inescapable. They were fighting the losing side of a resource war that had been decided before it began. Their courage, their skill, their willingness to die, none of it mattered against the arithmetic of American production. They could shoot down bombers, but more would come. They could sink ships, but more would be built. They could fight with every ounce of dedication they possessed, and they would still lose because dedication doesn't manufacture fuel or smelt aluminum or grow food. The tragedy was not in the losing. Losing was inevitable. The tragedy was that the war was fought at all, that millions died and Japan was destroyed for a cause that arithmetic had shown to be hopeless from the outset. The refrigerators didn't cause Japan's defeat. The industrial disparity they represented had determined the outcome long before any pilot opened a bomber fuselage and found fresh eggs and butter, but they symbolized that outcome perfectly. They made visible and tangible the vast gulf between American abundance and Japanese scarcity, between the world's richest nation and a regional power that had punched far above its weight class and paid a terrible price for the miscalculation. In the quiet years after the war, as Japan rebuilt and memory of combat faded, the refrigerators remained a symbol and cautionary tale. They appeared in memoirs, in oral histories, in the stories veterans told their children. They represented the moment of understanding, the instant when propaganda fell away and reality became undeniable. They were proof that wars are won not by courage alone, but by the unglamorous arithmetic of logistics and production. They were evidence that material conditions matter, that economic strength translates to military power, that abundance and prosperity are not weaknesses, but fundamental sources of national capability. The American refrigerator in the bomber, humming quietly on emergency power, its contents spilled across the wreckage, contained a lesson in military history more profound than any tactical manual. It taught that nations fight with their economies as much as their armies, that industrial capacity determines outcomes in ways that courage and skill cannot overcome, that the side which solves logistics wins the war. Japan learned this lesson at catastrophic cost. The pilots who saw those refrigerators, who held bottles of cold milk in their shaking hands and understood what it meant, carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. It was knowledge born from defeat and deprivation, from hunger and loss, and the bitter realization that they had fought for a cause doomed from the start. But it was also knowledge that rebuilt a nation, that informed Japan's post-war transformation, that helped ensure such miscalculations would not be repeated. Modern Japan, prosperous and peaceful, stands in part on lessons learned from refrigerators and bombers. Lessons about the nature of power, the importance of economic strength, the futility of military adventurism without the industrial capacity to sustain it. Those lessons came at the cost of millions of lives and the destruction of a nation. They were learned in wreckage and starvation, in the slow collapse of supply lines and the steady attrition of forces that couldn't be replaced. They were learned by pilots who flew into combat on empty stomachs and found their enemies eating fresh food at altitude. They were learned through bitter experience, through defeat and occupation, through the humiliation of depending on former enemies for survival. But they were learned. And perhaps that, ultimately, is what the refrigerators represent. Not just American abundance or Japanese defeat, but the possibility of learning from catastrophic mistakes, of building something better from ruins, of transforming the lessons of war into the foundations of peace. The pilots who saw those refrigerators are gone now, but their testimony remains. A reminder that material reality constrains what nations can accomplish through force, that prosperity and power are intertwined, that courage alone cannot substitute for the unglamorous logistics that determine military outcomes.
The refrigerators hummed in the wreckage, keeping milk cold at 20,000 feet, symbolizing an abundance so vast that Japan had never stood a chance. That is the truth the pilots learned, the lesson they carried, the knowledge that rebuilt a nation. And it is a truth worth remembering. Wars are won by those who can afford to put refrigerators in their bombers.